Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about Gazprom, the Russian company that controls all of Russia's gas supplies. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that Gazprom posted a loss of $7 billion in 2023. And this was the first time that the company had posted a loss for more than 20 years. And this business should be making an absolute fortune because Russia is sitting on the largest natural gas supplies in the world. It has around 24% of the total global reserves. And natural gas remains in strong demand because over the last 30 years, a lot of countries have moved away from using coal to produce electricity to using natural gas because it produces around 50% less CO2 emissions. And up until the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was supplying Europe with natural gas through all of the pipelines that it had installed over the last 30 or 40 years. But obviously, as a result of that invasion, the European countries have turned their back on Russia and no longer want to buy it. And in today's video, I want to talk about a report that the Russian authorities instructed to investigate how long it's going to take Gazprom to get back to the same position it was in before the war started. And I can tell you, heads up, spoiler alert here, that it's more than 10 years. And actually, when you look at the details, I'm not sure that Gazprom is ever going to get back to the position it was in before the war started. So in today's video, I'll have a look at what's going on with supply and demand for natural gas. And natural gas is basically in two different forms. There is the natural form, which you can send to people through a pipeline, or you can liquefy it and put it onto ships, and that's called liquefied natural gas. So we'll have a look at the dynamics of what's going on with both of those markets, because that's really important from Russia's point of view. They've really dropped the ball in terms of LNG, so we'll have a look at that data. We'll also talk about the findings of this report that was instructed by the Russian authorities. We'll talk about what's going on at Gazprom, because this is a company that employs around 500,000 people in Russia. It's one of the biggest employers. And obviously, if it's in disarray, that's going to cause major problems for all of those people. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen for Gazprom over the course of the next 6 to 12 months and what the implications of this are for the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supported the channel. It really does mean a lot to me. I know I've said it before, but it does. If you're a long-term supporter of the channel, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you can also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that support. Really helps keeping me motivated, keeps me thinking up more videos to post on a regular basis. And if you've sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee, I really appreciate the time and effort that you've taken to do that. It means a lot to me. I see those messages, I read all of them, so I know who's sending them to me. Thank you. I don't have time to reply every single time, but thanks for sending them. It does help to keep me going. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, Russia is sitting on the largest gas reserves out of any country in the world by some way. And that means that Russia should be dominant in this market globally. And up until its invasion of Ukraine, it was the world's biggest supplier. However, it's now lost that position, and it looks like it's now very vulnerable to being replaced by other countries who are far further advanced in terms of their liquefied natural gas capabilities. This chart shows the countries with the largest gas reserves in the world. And as you can see, Russia is right at the top of this list, holding over 24% of the total global reserves. Iran is second with 17.3%, and Qatar is third with 12.5%. And between them, those three countries hold over 54% of the total reserves. So that should mean that they are the three biggest players globally. The United States comes in at number 4, but in relative terms, it's small, holding only 5.3%, so around 20% of the reserves that Russia's sitting on. Saudi Arabia has just over 4%, Turkmenistan just under 4%, the UAE 3.1%, Venezuela 2.8%, Nigeria 2.6%, and China 2.4%. And I just wanted to make the point that Australia isn't in the top 10. In fact, it's not even in the top 20 or the top 25. it's sitting at number 27 and has around 0.4% of the total global reserves of natural gas. And the reason that I'm mentioning this, I'll come on to later, but Australia is a big player in liquefied natural gas despite the fact that it doesn't have huge reserves. And in terms of establishing which countries are in the best position to start exporting natural gas, this chart shows the top 10 consumers. And what this shows is that the USA is sitting at number 1, consuming around 22% of all natural gas. Russia is at number 2, consuming 12.4%. China comes in at a much lower level, 5.4% at number 3. Iran's number 4, followed by Japan, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Germany, Mexico, and the UAE. And if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that Germany was actually the largest buyer of Russian natural gas prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and the Nord Stream pipelines that had been constructed under the Baltic Sea were delivering around 60 billion cubic meters of gas directly to Germany every single year, until, of course, they suddenly exploded one day. Nobody really knows why, because we've had these investigations and there hasn't been a categorical announcement as to who was behind those explosions. There's still a lot of theories that Russia did it. Russia are saying that the West did it. Nobody really knows because nobody wants to reveal the secrets of what happened to those pipes. But what this consumption table shows us is that Russia isn't using all of the natural gas that it produces and therefore is exporting a lot of it. And up until the war in Ukraine, it was the world's number 1 exporter of natural gas products, both natural gas and LNG combined. The vast majority of gas that Russia was exporting was being exported directly to Europe via pipelines that had been constructed over the last 30 or 40 years. And this chart shows some of those pipelines, and you can see that the main ones were the Nord Stream pipeline that I mentioned earlier that was delivering huge amounts of natural gas directly to Germany, the Yamal pipeline that was taking gas into Central Europe, the Brotherhood pipeline that was passing through Ukraine and going into Central and Eastern Europe, and the South Stream pipeline that was taking gas to Southern Europe via Turkey. Now, in terms of assessing the global demand for natural gas, this chart plots the demand dating back to 1990 and forecasting out to 2050. And we've got 4 different colours on this chart. The black section at the bottom represents demand from the power industry, so basically using natural gas to produce electricity. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, it's a much more efficient way of producing electricity than coal in terms of emissions. It produces around 50% of the CO2 emissions that coal produces, so therefore is environmentally better for the globe. It's not as good as renewable energy, but it's better than coal. The light blue section above that is demand from industry. And the reason that industry wants to use natural gas is that you can create very high temperatures. So in certain production processes, it's difficult to get to the temperature that you want to just using electricity. Using gas, setting fire to it, creating a flame and heat is a much more efficient way for a lot of industries to basically use in their processes. The dark blue section above that is use in households and buildings, predominantly for heating and cooking purposes. So this is supplied directly into households in many countries. And then the final section at the top, which is the smallest by far, is transport. We still have gas-powered vehicles. And what this chart shows is really interesting because between 1990 and 2024, where we're sitting today, there was a strong and consistent increase in the global demand for natural gas. And one of the drivers for that, as we've discussed, is that environmentally it's better than some of the other fossil fuels. So therefore, countries saw it as a more efficient and cost-effective way of producing electricity. However, things are changing quite rapidly, and a lot of countries are now focusing in on renewable energy. So solar, wind, hydro, and in some instances people do refer to nuclear as renewable. It's a bit more of a debatable topic. And if we look at the second part of this chart from 2024 onwards, you can see that global demand has leveled off. It's basically plateaued. And 2037 is forecast to be the year with peak demand. So that's the time when demand for natural gas will be at its highest and beyond that point, it will start to decrease. So if you're sitting on large amounts of natural gas, you want to be making sure that you're selling as much of it as you can right now, because that demand profile could actually tail off a lot quicker if countries do decide to ramp up their renewable energy investment. This chart, produced by the consultant McKinsey, looks at the forecast changes in global gas supplies between 2020 and 2050. The black section at the bottom of this chart, which has been truncated, you can see that there's a slashed line across it. So basically it's not to scale because it would be far bigger than the other sections of this chart. Shows gas that's being supplied domestically. So where countries have their own supply, they're using that first before they're having to import gas. The blue section above it represents imports of gas via pipelines, and the grey section at the top represents imports of gas from LNG, so liquefied natural gas. And what this shows is that in 2020, 16% of imports were coming from pipelines globally, and 13% from LNG. So pipeline gas was the biggest source of importation. By 2035, it's estimated that LNG will have overtaken pipeline gas. It will equate to 18% compared to 15% for pipelines. And by 2050, it's estimated that LNG will be 23% of the market and pipelines only 14%. But the one thing to note about this chart, and this is why I really wanted to highlight it, is that this was created in 2020, so before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this assumed that the existing pipelines that Russia had in place, supplying huge markets such as Germany and Italy in Europe, would continue with those flows. However, as we know, that isn't the situation anymore. Those countries are no longer buying that gas from Russia, and Russia isn't selling it. So I think if McKinsey were creating this chart today, the LNG portion in 2035 would be significantly higher, potentially as high as 30% or even more, and the blue section would be much smaller because Russia is no longer transporting that volume of gas. And if we move over to the 2050 situation, the vast majority of that chart would be LNG. It wouldn't be pipeline gas, because the problem that Russia has is that it doesn't have other pipelines to be able to divert that gas into. The European pipelines are now redundant. They're not sending gas to those countries, and so the percentage of pipeline gas is far lower. The reason that I use this chart is that it's difficult to actually find data on this market. So this was a chart I came across which I think is useful, but I think if it was being created today, the figures would be quite different and there would be a much heavier skew towards LNG. And this table shows the key findings of the McKinsey report from 2020, which I thought were interesting. And if we start off by looking at point 2, it says that the 2020 market demand was driven by China and India, growing a combined 9.5 million metric tons. And it goes on to state that Asia will continue to drive global LNG demand growth. However, China becomes less important as a driver for LNG demand beyond 2035 and will see demand peak around 2040. South and Southeast Asia will take over as key demand drivers. And the reason that that's important and critical is that you can't build a pipeline from Russia to Southeast Asia. It would be far too expensive, be too complex in terms of all the geographies involved and also who's going to pay for it. So the market is growing, and the biggest growth in the market is in LNG. And the next point says that LNG demand is resilient. In 2020, it grew by 1% while global gas demand declined. Longer term, the share of LNG in the global gas supply market will increase from today's 13% to 23%. That's the figures that we just looked at, as it meets demand growth and replaces declining pipeline and domestic gas. So basically what that's saying is that as countries' own supplies start to dwindle, they'll need to import more, and the majority of the market will be LNG. And as we just discussed, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, I think we've seen an acceleration in that growth in the LNG market. Now, point 4 on McKinsey's summary here says that 100 million tonnes of additional liquefaction capacity was needed by 2035 and more than 200 million tonnes by 2050. And the majority of this is likely to come from USA projects. 138 million tonnes of LNG capacity is currently under construction, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. And the final point from McKinsey's paper was that the energy transition will reshape gas demand use. Gas demand in the transport sector is set to grow with a compound annual growth rate of 2.2%. Gas for power will decline in Europe, Japan and North America, and industrial and chemical gas demand will grow past 2035. And in terms of that point of LNG capacity, this chart shows the global capacity. The light blue section at the bottom represents all of the existing liquefied natural gas plants. The blue section above that, the light blue section, represents those that are under construction right now. The dark blue section is where Qatar is looking to really ramp up its LNG capacity. And the black section here represents projects that are still in discussion but haven't yet been signed off or approved. And you can see the red dotted lines here show the forecast level of demand for LNG out to 2050. So there is a clear gap in terms of demand and supply. So somebody needs to step up and start to build more LNG capacity. Otherwise, there's going to be an imbalance between supply and demand. And as we all know, if we get to that situation, that will drive up prices rapidly, and that's going to be bad news for the global economy. A recent press report published the findings of a paper looking into the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Gazprom. And that report states that Gazprom is unlikely to recover gas sales lost as a result of the invasion of Ukraine for at least a decade. The report states that the main consequences of sanctions for Gazprom and the energy industry are the contraction of export volumes, which will be restored to their 2020 level no earlier than 2035. The 151-page report, commissioned by company management and written late in 2023, is among the most candid acknowledgements yet of how Western sanctions imposed in response to Russia's war have damaged Gazprom and the wider Russian energy sector. Elena Rybakova, a non-resident senior fellow at the Washington-based Peterson Institute for International Economics, said it's very grim after reading the report. Gazprom is at a dead end and they're very much aware of it. Gazprom regularly orders outside research to help it argue for preferential treatment and extra financing from the Kremlin, according to Sergei Vakulenko, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin and former head of strategy at the company's oil arm Gazprom Neft. You can run around with a report like this and demand state report, he said, although he added that Russian officials were tough guys and you won't get anything out of them. Gazprom's share of Russia's energy exports will decline as pipeline gas, which has been hit particularly hard by the fallout from the invasion, takes a backseat to less vulnerable liquefied natural gas, according to the report. It adds that the company will struggle to return to growth without significant state support in finding new markets for its gas. Because Gazprom, which doesn't have its own proven technology for producing LNG at large capacity, is the only company exporting gas via pipeline, and those volumes are decreasing, Gazprom's role in the gas industry is accordingly expected to decrease. The report highlights how sanctions have cut Russia's energy industry off from the crucial technology, such as turbines, which help move gas through pipelines, as well as the spare parts and expertise required to repair them. It also studies the impact of Western sanctions in countries such as Iran, North Korea and Venezuela, in a sign that Russia is thoroughly preparing for permanent sanctions, according to Tatiana Mitrova, a research fellow at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. To their credit, the authors are not afraid to say that sanctions always lead to a decline in living standards and a loss of international competitiveness, Mitrova said. Gazprom's outlook has darkened even further since the report was submitted to senior executives in November 23, with the company reporting a loss of $6.9 billion last year. Russia is struggling to conclude a proposed deal with China for the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which Gazprom hopes will revive its exports. If completed on schedule in 2030, the Power of Siberia 2 is expected to bring additional capacity of 50 billion cubic meters per year. But China's ability to extract significantly lower prices than Europe paid for Russian gas means Gazprom's exports will be less profitable even if restored to pre-war volumes. The fundamental problem that they have is that most of the revenues were coming from Europe. Those have been lost, and the gas that was going to Europe cannot go to any other good market, said Craig Kennedy, a Harvard-affiliated scholar and former vice chair at Bank of America. The report estimates that Russia's LNG exports will rise to between 98.8 to 125.8 billion cubic metres in 2035, from 40.8 in 2020, and account for about half of total gas exports, increasing the influence of Novatek, Russia's largest and most technically advanced LNG producer, and other energy companies. To maintain its dominant position in the domestic gas market, Gazprom will need to exploit its monopoly over gas transit infrastructure and demand preferential treatment from the Kremlin. Gazprom will nonetheless lose market share to Novatek or be forced to use its LNG infrastructure. The report's authors said LNG could be a more reliable source of export revenue for Russia because it's transported on ships rather than pipelines and more difficult to track. Building LNG terminals on Russia's east coast, the authors write, could diversify exports beyond China and lessen the dependence that has allowed Beijing to control the price it pays for gas. But Gazprom would struggle to ramp up its own export capacity, the report added, if Russia could not end its dependence on Western-designed turbines, which are used for tasks such as electricity generation and compression, as well as moving gas. Russia's energy ministry says it expects companies to be able to repair US-made turbines by next year, but Russian manufacturers have yet to reproduce crucial parts of turbine production, the report says, with as much as 75% of the components needed coming from Western countries. Moscow could be forced to mothball or shut down power stations across the country if it cannot produce an alternative domestically, the report warns. A program to build gas turbines domestically would cost at least 100 billion rubles and take at least 5 years, the report estimated, adding that Gazprom would struggle to finance its investment program without a significant rise in revenues. The company, according to Kennedy, is pleading for Moscow to liberalise domestic gas prices or write us a big cheque and stop taxing us. Stop looking for us to fund the government needs to support us. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, Gazprom recently announced a loss of $7 billion for 2023. And that loss compared to a profit of 1.2 trillion rubles, or around $13 billion, in 2022. And if we look at this chart, which you may well be familiar with if you follow the channel, because I've referred to it a number of times, but it is a really useful piece of data because it gives us a breakdown of how much revenue Russia is earning from all of its different fossil fuel exports, including pipeline gas and LNG. And the key sections that we're looking here are the light brown sections, and I'm not entirely sure what colour it looks like on your screen. I'm often accused of being colourblind, but I think the screen I'm looking at, and then when it presents to you, maybe it looks a bit different, or maybe I'm colourblind, I'm not really sure, I haven't taken a test. But if we look at what I think is the light brown section on the far left-hand side, firstly, if we look at the larger light brown section, that shows pipeline gas, and then the smaller light brown section at the top shows LNG. And what this shows is that in January 2022, Russia was earning around $300 million per day from the sale of pipeline gas, which on an annualized basis equates to $110 billion. That is a large amount of cash for any economy. And on top of that, Russia was also earning around $100 million per day from the sale of liquefied natural gas, which on an annualized basis is around $36 billion. So in total, Russia was earning almost $150 billion per year from the sale of pipeline gas and LNG before the invasion of Ukraine. Now, if you move from left to right on this graph and look at the shape of both of those lines, you can see that there was a considerable reduction in the revenue that Russia was earning from pipeline gas. And the most recent figures for pipeline gas show that Russia is earning around $55 million per day, which equates on an annual basis to around $20 billion. So that is a reduction of $90 billion annually. And in terms of LNG sales, Russia is now earning around $40 million per day, which on an annualized basis is around $15 billion. So that represents another reduction of around $20 billion. So in total, compared with the situation before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's income from gas sales is down by about $110 billion per year. This chart shows the countries with the largest liquefied natural gas exports as of October 2023. So this is the latest data that we can find. And what this shows is that the world's largest exporter of LNG is the United States, followed by Australia. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, Australia has very small natural gas reserves in comparison to Russia. The size of Russia's reserves is actually more than 50 times the amount that Australia has. However, Australia has been very efficient in converting those gas reserves into LNG because it knows that it has to export via liquefied format because it's not possible for Australia to start building pipelines into Europe or anywhere else of that nature. The third largest supplier is Qatar, and between them, these three countries provide more than 50% of the total LNG that's exported around the world. Russia comes in at number 4 on this list, but as you can see, it's only exporting around 31 million tonnes per year, compared with 77 million for Qatar, 88 million for Australia, and 93 million for the USA. So what this shows us is that those three countries at the top have been investing heavily into LNG over the last 20 or 30 years. They've seen that this is the growth market. They've put that money into that infrastructure because these plants are very expensive. They cost billions of dollars, potentially tens of billions of dollars to construct, and they can take 4 or 5 years to get these things up and running. Russia didn't think it needed to do that, so it's been sitting back, letting all of the cash come in from the pipeline gas sales. It hasn't been reinvesting that money into developing LNG facilities, and in the long term, that is going to hurt Russia because it's now at the point where it's way behind the other three big players in the market, and in order to try to compete, Russia would need to construct these facilities. However, this is coming at a very bad time for Russia because, firstly, the natural gas sales are down significantly, as we've just discussed. They've lost over $100 billion worth of revenue, and that revenue could have been used to construct some LNG plants, but not anymore. And so it's not going to be possible for Gazprom or the other gas businesses to be able to self-fund these developments. So they need the Kremlin to stump up and pay for them. But obviously, at the moment, the Kremlin's main focus is the war in Ukraine. So this has come at a really bad time for Russia, and it really has been caught on the hop, and it's going to be left behind as the global demand for LNG increases and the three big powers at the top continue their dominance of the market. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening right now with natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and Gazprom is really interesting. Prior to the war in Ukraine, Gazprom was the world's largest gas business. It was making an absolute fortune, over $100 billion per year of revenue, and there wasn't actually that much work involved because all of the pipelines had been constructed, everything was in place. In fact, all Gazprom was thinking about was how it could build more pipelines, and it actually constructed Nord Stream 2, which was finished just before Russia invaded Ukraine. It was never actually commissioned. No gas was sent down it because the USA was concerned that Russia had too strong an influence on the European market, and I think that was probably right with hindsight. But Gazprom was very happy with its pipeline business, and this looked like Gazprom was continue being a hugely profitable business for the next 30 or 40 years. But as a result of Russia's political decision to invade Ukraine, countries such as Germany and Italy made the very difficult decision to turn their back on Russian gas and start to buy liquefied natural gas from countries such as the USA and Qatar. Now, obviously, that involved much more cost for Germany and Italy than the pipeline gas from Russia. However, this was a political decision, not an economic one. And the problem that Gazprom and Russia have is that, unlike oil, it's very difficult to be able to pivot and do something with your natural gas because in its natural form, it's a gas. And so you can't just put it onto a ship and send it to India and China. You have to liquefy it. And that process is quite complicated, and it involves lots of different systems, and it's hugely expensive to construct. And Russia, over the last 30 years, simply hasn't been focusing on LNG. Unlike the USA, Qatar and Australia, which are the three largest players in the world who have been heavily investing into those industries. Russia hasn't, and it's now been caught on the back foot, and it's going to be left behind. And this is a major problem from Russia's point of view because it's lost all of this revenue, as we talked about earlier, around 120 or 130 billion dollars per year has disappeared from the coffers. And it can't replace that with any other sales because it doesn't have the ability to get that gas and put it into a liquefied form and sell it into new markets. So Gazprom has gone from being the largest gas business in the world to a company that's now making huge losses. It employs around 500,000 people in Russia. Those people's jobs are now at risk because Gazprom can't continue booking huge losses. It's simply not viable to do that. And unless it can come up with a plan to try to convert the gas into revenue, it's going to have to downsize. And that's going to have a hugely negative impact, not just on Gazprom, but on all of those employees. And as we've talked about before, there is a domino impact. If you get made redundant, or your salary gets cut, or you don't get a bonus, or you're not being paid overtime, then that means you've got less money. Therefore, you'll spend less in your local economy. All the stores in your local area, the gyms, the restaurants, all of those sort of things will receive less money. So they'll be contracting. They may have to release some of their staff, and so it goes on. So you can get this negative ripple effect starting to spread. And Gazprom, being one of the largest employers in Russia, will be sending a very negative message to a lot of Russians because this is a business that, like the property market in China, could do no wrong for the last 20 years. It just went up and up and up in terms of profitability. However, that has now stopped and it's now in a situation where it's potentially having to downsize, and people will be getting nervous that the war in Ukraine is now starting to have a real life impact on their everyday lives. So the overall summary of today's video is that Gazprom was once the largest gas company in the world. As a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's lost the majority of its markets and the majority of its exports. It hasn't been planning for the future. It hasn't been building LNG plants, so it can't convert that gas into LNG. So the gas is going to remain under the ground. Gazprom won't be able to monetize it. It's making losses. Those losses are likely to continue. That's going to have a knock-on implication to the Russian economy. And all of this is really bad news for Russia over the course of the next 12 to 18 to 24 months. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. I'm sorry my voice is a little bit croaky today, but it's just the way it is today, unfortunately. I can't do anything about it. But thanks for watching all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.